But it's getting to that point where that tolerance is going so far beyond that we're giving it to certain groups of people who should not have it. Like now that they're, as you've seen, how they're not calling pedophiles anymore. They're calling M.A.Ps, minor attracted people.
Yes.
And they've got their own flag now and everything else like that. And is it horrible if you wake up, if you're born in a body where you're attracted to, young children? Of course, that could be the worst thing ever. But, at the end of the day, to sit there and tolerate to a point and, give them their own, they have their own flag. And now it's sort of, we're seeing now with this movement, it's sort of pushing and pushing, and that grooming behavior is becoming more and more in society, with how kids as young as 5 are now talking about sex ed.
I wanted to get into that with you. Thanks for bringing this one up, because this is a very difficult, and this really gets to the heart, a very uncomfortable conversation, right? In regards to talk, because here's from my voluntarist perspective on this kind of stuff, in terms of the reason I have difficulty with something like this is because in terms of the fact that I don't like something, right? In terms of whereas I may choose not to tolerate it, I'm still not willing to force people not to be able to do something if they're not infringing on someone's rights. Obviously, if you're violating a minor or something like that, that's very different. But in terms of people, this is the freedom of speech thing. How do you feel about people? You brought this up, pushing forth the idea of M.A.Ps. I mean, granted, you may not like it. Are you going to go as far as saying that they should not be allowed to censor this? And it's one thing if you call yourself, if you believe in censorship, but if you are a free speech absolutist, then you have to even be in favor is perhaps not the right word, but you have to allow people putting forth ideas that are even disgusting as M.A.Ps and talking. And this is one of the issues. Then I watched a video in the 50s where they addressed a very similar theme around whether or not they were going to accept people to push forth communism. This is on the backs of the Second World War, where the people saw just how evil these systems of governance were, right? And there was this guy, highly intelligent, articulate, can't remember what nationality he was. He was making this cogent argument, which I did not agree with, but was so perspicacious and brilliant, that if you allow these people to put forth these ideas, it's going to destroy these free societies where we respect freedom of speech. So we cannot even tolerate the people pushing forth ideas of communism. And you could apply that communism, regardless of what it is, to the M.A.Ps or pedophilia and so forth. And I mean, I still think the principle stand. If you're a free speech absolutist, you still have to allow people to say that. But the problem arises in that by allowing that, you were potentially allowing an ideology to infiltrate into your society, affect your children, and even erode in respect to communism and so forth, the very freedoms that you were trying to uphold. Do you get where I'm saying?
Mm.
So what are your thoughts?
I'll let Peter go first.
Yeah, on the M.A.Ps and I guess that argument at large.
Okay, so I'll start with the M.A.Ps and then say about communism.
Okay.
Now with M.A.Ps, with M.A.Ps, I'd say it's a different story, because with M.A.Ps, it's genuinely a case of causing harm to another person. It's the same thing as having pedophile pride. Now, there's a degree to which tolerance in its strictest sense could be applied to someone who, say, they have a psychological issue and they think, I'm finding myself attracted to children, and they immediately, like any rational person who would have such a thought, would think this is absolutely monstrous, go and check themselves into a pretty intensive psychological therapy to try and relieve themselves. That would be something that maybe you could have a degree of tolerance or understanding for. A person who sits on Twitter and tweets about how proud they are to be a M.A.P and how M.A.P pride, that is something there should be no tolerance for, because that is literally advocating for predatory behavior towards those who can't consent.
But wait, I got to call you out on that. I got to call you on that. This is not the interest of not disagreeing with you per se, but the argument, right? Because I always try to be specific about this. How is saying that you are proud of the fact that you were a M.A.P, glorifying the fact that you were something, how is that inciting or causing harm at anyone? You're basically declaring how you feel about a particular ideology. Because here's the thing, because I think this is really important, because people use this in order to justify how, putting symbols up on Twitter about X and Y is incitement of violence, when you're just expressing your opinion about something. Like, I want you to be more specific about how that's a violation of someone's rights and so forth.
Well, because it's a specific advocation for a behavior. By saying, I am attracted to these people, I am proud of the fact that I'm attracted to these people, implies by extension a degree of pursuit of that attraction. If it's something that a person's ashamed of, I'm attracted to children, this is a terrible situation, it's very different to, let's all be proud. And then that's when in many of these instances with Twitter and the Twitter maps, they contact underage people and they find themselves in web forums. They use it to connect with other pedophiles. And then the result of advocating for this pride. I'm not saying that it should be a criminal offense to come out and say, I'm a proud MAP. It should be a criminal offense as soon as they start pursuing children.
Sure, they were in agreement on. Sure, but go on. Sorry.
But the other thing that I sort of want to play a bit of devil's advocate on is the point about communism, where I understand the argument about how it's potentially a dangerous ideology that can affect children. However, to play devil's advocate, what's the difference between saying, have no tolerance for communism, if someone's a communist, report them, and what that police chief in Melbourne was saying is, if someone believes in conspiracy theories, you ought to report them.
Oh, no, just to be clear, I wasn't advocating for the idea that you shouldn't be supporting communism, right? I was just expressing that guy's opinion. But to be consistent here, yes, you absolutely, within the realm of like an actual free society, have to allow people speaking, even speaking about promoting communism and so forth, provided it's not the incitement of violence or incitement of like violation of other people's rights and so forth. So if a communist was saying, I want to throw over the government and make a communist society, that would be a direct incitement, right? However, people expressing the ideas of communism, talking about how they think it's a better system and so forth. I mean, the way it works is as long as you're not inciting imminent violence, you absolutely have a right to say that. And I'm just trying to be consistent here. So if I was to apply that with the whole MAPS thing, the same thing applies, regardless of how I feel like I distaste both of those scenarios, right? However, if I'm trying to be consistent, I still have to allow people to be able to express these ideas if I'm being consistent here. That's how I look at it.
I do understand that. No, so go ahead.
Yeah.
The issue is also, it's like you're talking about universal laws. And one of the universal laws is, again, do no harm. When you get to a group of people like MAPS who sit there and start talking to each other online or in groups, that actually causes quite a dangerous vacuum, because it creates this bubble where they feel like their behavior is accepted. There's a great study by this Tamara Sweller that did this in 2018. That did this study, and it looked at treating sex offenders in custody and seeing if sex offender therapy actually helped. What they actually found was sex offender treatment actually did not work at all. It actually had the reverse effect, because when you got the sex offenders in this group dynamic, they sort of affirmed each other's beliefs. And then when they were released, they were more likely to recidivate. So that's where it becomes dangerous, and where we sit there and be like, well, where do we draw the line? Like, if we're going to sit there and be like, well, let them talk amongst themselves. But again, we've seen how it creates these bubbles of people where they get accepted in that community, similar to what we see with TikTok and trans and all these other different communities popping up, like people who pretend to have mental disorders when they don't,
sure.
I look at personality in that.
I completely sympathize with where you're coming from this. And as much as you want to do everything you possibly can to prevent these things from being perpetuated, whether it's communism or MAPS or any other disdainful behavior and so forth, to me, it's like a chess game where you have to work within the realm of the law, right? Like, there's certain things you can and cannot do. In terms of the scenario specifically that you're outlining here, if we're talking about something that is dangerous in terms of can lead to problems and so forth, that's very different to something that is objectively dangerous. Like, people always, it seems like a subtle point, but it's so important to realize that there's a distinction between doing something that may lead to something, may offend people, may perpetuate behavior and so forth, versus someone actually doing something like hitting you, violating you, raping you and so forth. That is a direct action. So when it comes to the brass tacks, so to speak, this is about direct forms of violence versus more kind of like implied or subjective forms of violence, you know, because people make this argument in regards to freedom of speech, right? Issue recently that came about with Elon Musk taking Kanye. And from what I understand, after Kanye basically tweeted this image of it's actually a Raelian symbol, but it showed the Star of David with a SWAT sticker. And Elon Musk, from what I understand, he didn't directly say this, but he made a tweet about how he's cool with unpleasant photos of him being shown, but he draws the line at I can't remember what he said specifically, but it was in reference, we think, to that symbol. And the idea is that that symbol was supposed to be incitement, right? Because it's going to bring about, and in the context of what Kanye did, right? Don't get me wrong. Stuff he went and did was fucking weird and crazy, right? But specifically speaking, to say that showing a symbol there, which, by the way, objectively has no reference to the Nazi symbol, like the actual origins of that are very different. But because you think of that as inciting violence, as going to bring about violence, it's not an objective argument. There's so much interpretation in that. And the idea of showing, I use that example because there's a distinction between someone going out and saying, look, I think we need to kill Jews. Obviously, I'm not saying that we should kill Jews. That's freaking horrible, right? Versus someone that says, I don't like Jews and I think they suck, right? Which both morally reprehensible, all right, with the former being the worst, but the latter is not something that is incitement of violence. And the only reason I'm harping on this is because I think it's important to delineate between the direct and the indirect. Otherwise, we think everything is subjective and we have this amorphous idea, and people are getting mad at each other because they think that one person is violating them, the other isn't. And that's how I look at it, in honesty, trying to be objective.
I do broadly agree. I'd say, but on the map example though, there are certain like norms and standards that, as repressive as they may be, that we need to implement as a society in order to preserve the continued existence of society. And what is the most precious thing? The most precious thing that we have for the future continuation of humanity is our children. Our children are the most precious thing in the world. So when someone is advocating publicly for effectively war against our children, that's more extreme than advocating for war against Western society or war against the government or war against a specific country or war against any kind of system. It's effectively a war against humanity, and it's an affront to everything that all societal standards throughout history, everything that we need to stand for our continued existence. It's almost like how in times of war, it's always been the norm throughout all of history to censor enemy publications. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that whatsoever. And in many instances of war, whether it be the First World War, whether it be even the situation right now in Russia and Ukraine and how we're not receiving the Russian side of the story, it is an imposition on free speech. However, the arguments that government uses because, in order to win this war, we need to make sure that society is on board. And I think beyond any of that, beyond any kind of disagreements you can have about territory or power balances in the world, advocating for violence against children, not only violence, but sexual violence causing devastating psychological harm. Not only that, but hearing these ideas being like promulgated online about, our children, sexual topics about children, advocating for normalizing relationships with children, it goes beyond like communist extremism or Islamic extremism or Republican extremism or any kind of extremism towards just an insult to humanity. That's where I think that pedophilia is exception to all of these rules, all of these standards, and even though it may sound subjective and it may sound extreme, that's the group that really there can be no tolerance for whatsoever. No tolerance for whatsoever, in my opinion.
I think most people would agree with that sentiment. In regards to the Balenciaga thing, which I actually don't know that much about, how does that work for you guys? Because do you perhaps want to give me a breakdown of what's going on there, Nicolette?
Well, it was the ad campaigns that came out, and it wasn't just the kids posing with these bondage teddy bears, but it was also other ad campaigns that was around it. And it was things such as, I don't know if you know much into it, there was the Adidas handbag that had that sort of case that talked about child exploitation or child pornography.
Okay.
But there was also in the actual photos of other campaigns where they had this book of this artist, and in this book of this artist had if you looked at the actual book of this artist, it had mutilated images of children, with their arms severed and bloodied and cut off.
Wait. So these images mutilated, that was not in any of the stuff they showed. However, this artist had stuff that had images of that nature. His book, that wasn't shown. That wasn't shown in the actual Balenciaga.
But the actual book, it was the spine of the book. You see the title and the author.
Oh,
and
you see the title.
Those images.
Okay.
And not only that, one of the CEOs of I can't remember. He's married to Selma Hayek. I forgot his name. Sorry. He actually sells these artistic figurines of children with penises on their nose and mouths as anuses. And he sells these to people. So it's just this spiral of all this sort of really just graphic things with children, like mutilations, and people buy this. And they're looking at, I think, looked at one was like $12,000, and this sells. And the biggest adversity of all this, and all this is coming up, is that out of all Hollywood and all these people who are behind every topic and virtue signaling everywhere are just silent. And not even like Selma Hayek, Nicole Kidman, I think Emma Watson, obviously there's Kim Kardashian and all that stuff. And people are just silent, and no one's like, it's the general lay people are, they're getting their Balenciaga and burning it, but it's, this is a big issue, and even Balenciaga are silent on this as well. And this is where, like, it's deafening, and people are noticing this now. This is not just and Balenciaga have even like completely wiped their whole Instagram account, because if you go into it, they'll probably find more and more evidence. But anything to add, Peter? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if it was just one thing, I mean, the bondage doll thing kind of, I think that was the one that kind of blew the whole thing open in the first place. That was already a step too far. But if it was just like, for example, having the court documents about child pornography or whatever it was on the table, like, how does that happen? How does that coincidentally be the only papers that you have appear there? How do you also have just this book on the shelf here by a paedophile artist with paedophile art in it? Like, it's too many coincidences.
It's so blatant. It's the idea of someone just not caring whatsoever, having that level of like brashness that they'd go and do something that is socially so morally reprehensible and being like, nah, nothing's gonna happen. It's kind of like, to me, Kanye going out and saying, Hitler, Hitler's a good guy, especially that kind of thing. It's like, it's like what the fuck is going on here? I guess what I'm curious about is how, I mean, do you think the majority of the people that don't have a problem with this, they don't have a problem with it because it's like a political thing, in terms of, because they see this stuff generally, I'm assuming, being done by people that align more with the left? Or do you think people that do tend to don't have a problem with it, they just don't have a problem with this kind of stuff because that's how they feel when it, I'd imagine the left are more, I could be wrong, but I believe that they're more liberal when it comes to sexuality and so forth than we'd see. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. It shouldn't be a left or right issue.
Well, it is. I'm talking when I say in terms of like, when I say you're right, it should, and in terms of the politics, absolutely. But I think there would be a clear case where, for instance, people on the left, generally speaking, there's certain values that they will have over people on the right. People write more about state, God, property rights, and so forth. People on the left, bleeding hearts, want to have, tolerate everything, even things that are ridiculous, even things like M.A.Ps. So I think we'd all agree that, generally speaking, you will find that there is a political group of people that tend to support ideas like this. And I could be wrong, but I think it's pretty clear to see, right? What are your thoughts? Do you think that the left typically are the one? I mean, I guess the real question is, why do you think that this stuff is a lot of people don't have a problem with it?
I think a lot of people, with all the herd mentality stuff that we've seen, people see that, you know, when there's like a big issue like Black Lives Matter or any other major issue, they see a huge amount of public support from the public, but also from a lot of celebrity advocates and a lot of the mainstream media. And then people think, this is a big issue and it's something to get passionate about. But with the whole Balenciaga thing, there hasn't been that celebrity outcry. There has been a degree of public outcry. There's been some discussion in the press, and I will actually say, even though I don't think this is a left-right issue, it has only been some of the right-wing press in the UK that's been reporting on this. It hasn't really been covered in the more left-wing outlets. But at the same time, it's not a right-wing, left-wing issue. At the end of the day, it's just a case of seeing how overt this depravity is becoming, because it's always been around. I mean, you go back to like the old school like 90s conspiracy theorists, where it's you look at the Little Mermaid and how like some of the posters look a little bit like there's a penis on a poster, or that they animated. Actually, that was kind of weird. They did animate the priest getting an erection at one scene for no real reason. And then there was a version of another movie that when they released it on VHS, there was like a scene where for like a couple of frames, they inserted like a photograph of a nude woman for some reason on the VHS release. So there's always been weird predatory stuff that's being pushed on children. But when it comes to this whole Balenciaga situation, it's the most overt that it's ever been. But I think also partly because of this culture of shame, not only are celebrities not coming out and speaking out against it, but because there's been so much stigma, so much war on the so-called conspiracy theorists and mocking of the old, the crazy Christian types, the crazy radicals about, everything is pedophilia, everything is attacking our children. When these very, very obvious examples manifest, some people are too scared to actually speak out against it for the fear of being labeled as some kind of crazy radical right-wing conspiracy theorist, whatever labels that the mainstream media attaches. But if you look at a lot of the left-wing mainstream media, they're not going to be talking about Balenciaga. And I think people who are more entirely following the mainstream are probably more worried that or more expect that the mainstream media are going to portray it, rather than the problem being Balenciaga, being that people making a big deal out of nothing. Oh, it's just some papers in the background of a photo. Oh, it's just a doll that someone's posing with. And people are too scared, just the same way that people were too scared not to wear masks, people were too scared not to get vaccinated. It's exactly the same thing. It's this mission creep, and it's the collective hive ownership of the mind in modern society by the depraved powers that be.
You mentioned a point there. You made reference to people on the left being the ones to not speak out about this thing as much. And that's definitely what I see. I've definitely seen the people that I have seen, the little clips that have been speaking out about this. They typically had politics that you would align more, at least the left would define as being right-wing and so forth. They're more conservative or libertarian or based off of these, what we'd call right-wing ideals. I mean, one of the things that I've definitely seen is that when someone on the left tends to say the wrong thing. For instance, they say something that's completely racist and so forth, make a remark. Like I see a black guy saying something that's very racist. However, they have the right kind of politics on the left. They do not get as targeted by the media. And when that's a black person that has the wrong kind of politics, right, says something that is very inappropriate, however, is more aligned to the right wing and so forth, they get targeted and so forth. And this, I think, is ostensibly what we've been seeing for a long while now. Like, people, when they have the right kind of politics, they can get away with doing a lot of wrong things. And I think what we're seeing with Balenciaga is a case where the way, just me having a cursory look at what has been promulgated on the internet, like the people that are coming out and speaking out against this, what I'm seeing is that because the instigators of this Balenciaga stuff, they tend to have the right kind of politics, right? They're probably more identified as Democrats on the left and so forth. The tendency is for these people to want to, it's like, well, let's keep it on the low. They're in our group, so we don't want to target them. In the same way, the black people, when what's his name? Smollett, right? Like, he comes out.
Oh, Jussie Smollett.
Yeah, absolutely. You know how he essentially paid those guys to, pull that bullshit about. The point I just wanted
This is
to make,
Trump territory.
Yeah, the Black community, typically, even Dave Chappelle made a joke about this. They're keeping quiet about it, right? Because you don't, I mean, I'd be inclined to be like, let's just not talk about it because he's one of us. You know what I mean? This is kind of like the group. So I disagree in the sense that it isn't a political thing. I think it very much is a political thing. That's why it hasn't been pushed by ostensibly the left. You gon' pay the price, you won't make it.